Congresswoman, with all due respect, you're out of your depth, Alan Dershowitz sneered, his voice carrying that sharp mix of condescension and certainty that only decades of unchecked authority could polish. The studio lights caught the glint of his glasses as he leaned back in his chair, smugness practically dripping from every syllable. The audience could almost feel the chill of arrogance sweep across the set, as if he believed the very weight of his resume could crush dissent. The camera cut to Jasmine Crockett's face. Her expression was still calm, but her eyes, sharp, unwavering, told a different story. They reflected not intimidation, but focus, a fire barely contained. It was the kind of look that comes from years of being underestimated, dismissed, spoken over, and yet never defeated. In that moment, no one knew what was about to unfold, but everyone could sense something was building. Dershowitz continued, his tone growing more patronizing by the second. I've debated constitutional law with the greatest minds of our era. Frankly, you should take notes rather than try to argue with me. He chuckled to himself as if the insult would vanish into the air without consequence. The set grew tense. Viewers at home could feel their fists clench. It wasn't just a comment, it was a dismissal, an erasure, the kind of verbal strike that cut at something deeper than policy. The silence after his words was deafening. Even the host hesitated, unsure whether to interject or let the tension hang. And in that pause, the stage belonged not to the seasoned professor who thought he owned it, but to the congresswoman whose quiet strength had already begun to steal the air from the room. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not forced, not performative, but the smile of someone who knows the storm is about to turn. The audience leaned closer, breaths held, as though they could feel the energy shifting through the screen. Because this wasn't just another exchange. This was a challenge, hurled in public, meant to belittle, to humiliate. And yet, it was about to backfire in spectacular fashion. What she said next would leave Dershowitz and millions watching in absolute silence. This wasn't just another TV spat. It was a clash that exposed the deep cracks in American political discourse, cracks that had been widening for years. On one side sat Alan Dershowitz, the elder statesman of courtroom theatrics, armed with prestige, legacy, and the conviction that authority itself was an argument. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman, a rising star whose very presence represented a shift in who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and who gets to define what power looks like in America. The confrontation mattered because it wasn't confined to the studio. It was an echo of the culture war raging far beyond those walls, a war of old privilege versus new representation, of ivory towers against lived experience. Every dismissive word from Dershowitz was bigger than him. It was the voice of an establishment that had too often told women, immigrants, and people of color that they didn't belong at the table. And every glance, every measured breath from Crockett was more than composure. It was defiance against the very idea that dignity could be talked over, that truth could be patronized into silence. Viewers watching at home felt the stakes instinctively. They had lived versions of this moment, in classrooms where their intelligence was questioned, in boardrooms where their ideas were stolen, in family gatherings where their voices were drowned out. To see Crockett face down Dershowitz wasn't just political theater. It was personal validation. Millions felt she was standing in for them, carrying the weight of their own silenced moments. And that weight pressed heavier with each passing second. Dershowitz leaned into his credentials, flashing the resume of a man who had long believed debate was his arena and his alone. Crockett, meanwhile, waited, calm, quiet, letting the arrogance of his monologue build like kindling stacked too high. The audience could sense that sooner or later, that fire would consume itself. Who would win control of the narrative? Would the seasoned legal mind succeed in drowning out his opponent with credentials and arrogance? Or would Crockett find a way to pierce through the noise with a single moment that turned the tables? That question hung in the air like static, a tension that pulled viewers deeper into their seats. Because this wasn't about law. It wasn't about precedent. It was about something rawer, something far more consequential: respect, voice, and belonging in a nation still wrestling with who gets to lead its conversations. The clash on that stage was the story of America itself, old power trying to hold its ground, and new voices demanding to be heard. And as the camera panned back to Alan Dershowitz with that same smug tilt of the chin, the audience didn't yet know it. But the villain of this story had already begun to write his own downfall. Alan Dershowitz was no stranger to the spotlight. For decades, his name had been synonymous with the highest-profile trials, the sharpest debates, and the most polarizing defenses in American legal history. He was the man networks called, when they wanted a soundbite wrapped in gravitas, the professor who had turned courtroom combat into a second language. In many ways, Dershowitz had built a career on being unshakable, untouchable, the mind that could out-argue anyone. His resume read like a timeline of modern American scandals. A legal prodigy who became one of Harvard's youngest tenured law professors, Dershowitz quickly made a reputation for himself as both brilliant and combative. He stood up for civil liberties, teaching students that the Constitution was more than parchment, that it was a shield against tyranny. He defended unpopular defendants on principle, claiming the right to counsel was sacred, no matter who sat at the defense table. But for every case that burnished his image as a champion of rights, another chipped away at that veneer. He became known not just as a defender of principles, but as the lawyer who attached himself to the rich, the powerful, and the notorious. O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein. A list of names that sparked outrage, suspicion, and controversy. The contradictions were glaring: champion of rights in one breath, defender of the indefensible in the next. He insisted it was about the law, about ensuring fairness. But to critics, it looked like a man too eager to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who had power to abuse. On television, the contradictions grew sharper. Dershowitz carved out a second career as a media pundit, mastering the art of cutting off opponents with a sharp quip or drowning them in an avalanche of legal jargon. He thrived in spaces where deference was given freely, where moderators let him run long and panelists rarely pressed too hard. He wore arrogance like armor, certain that credentials would shield him from serious challenge. It worked for years. He was the elder statesman, the intellectual heavyweight. When Dershowitz spoke, others quieted. When he lectured, opponents either folded or fumbled. He had become so accustomed to controlling the tempo, to setting the terms of every debate, that arrogance wasn't just part of his persona, it was his strategy. But arrogance is a dangerous crutch. It blinds, dulls awareness, makes a man deaf to subtle shifts in power. On this night, in this debate, that crutch would betray him. For in Jasmine Crockett, he was not facing a timid student or a hesitant panelist. He was facing a woman who had made a career out of being underestimated, a fighter who had no patience for condescension disguised as brilliance. The irony was thick. Dershowitz had spent a lifetime telling juries to look past appearances, to dig into the substance of arguments, to resist being swayed by theater. Yet here he was, leaning entirely on performance, on sneers, interruptions, and the weight of his name. He didn't notice that the audience was shifting, that viewers were bristling, that his arrogance wasn't intimidating anymore. It was alienating. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't a titan delivering wisdom. This was a man on autopilot, so insulated by years of deference that he couldn't see the ground shifting beneath his feet. And Crockett, calm and patient, was letting him talk himself into the very corner he believed didn't exist. Dershowitz thought he was still writing the script, but arrogance, once a weapon, was now the setup for his own unraveling. And tonight, the unraveling was about to begin. Jasmine Crockett's story was never meant to fit the mold of Washington politics. She didn't emerge from the gilded halls of Ivy League privilege or inherit a Rolodex of connections that could open doors on command. Her path began far from the spotlight, in the trenches of public service where resources were scarce, the odds stacked high, and the victories hard-earned. Before she was ever a congresswoman facing down Alan Dershowitz on live television, Crockett was an attorney who chose clients others overlooked. People without money, without clout, without anyone to speak for them. In courtrooms where the walls seemed to lean toward the powerful, she stood tall for the powerless. She defended tenants fighting eviction, workers denied fair pay, families trampled by bureaucracy. Each case was more than paperwork. It was dignity on trial. And in every victory, large or small, Crockett sharpened the grit that would define her. She didn't just study the law, she lived its consequences. Where Dershowitz wielded legalese like a sword, detached and precise, Crockett wielded humanity like a shield. She could translate the cold language of statutes into flesh and blood reality. That was her gift, authenticity. It wasn't performance, it was lived truth, and people felt it every time she spoke. Her rise into Congress wasn't inevitable, it was improbable. She was underestimated at every step, dismissed by those who thought politics required polish over substance, pedigree over persistence. But persistence became her currency. She knocked doors others avoided, built coalitions others ignored, and carried herself not with entitlement, but with urgency. She was propelled not by ego, but by the communities who saw in her someone who finally listened. And they underestimated her. They always do. That underestimation became her armor. Each time someone smirked at her candidacy, each time a pundit wrote her off, each time a seasoned politician underestimated her presence in the room, she stored it away like fuel. Crockett learned that dignity wasn't handed out. It was claimed. By the time she took her seat in Congress, she carried more than her own ambition. She carried the struggles of women told they were too loud, too bold, too unpolished for power. She carried the quiet dignity of immigrants who sacrificed everything to be heard in a country that often refused to listen. She carried the exhaustion of communities of color asked again and again to prove their worthiness. To see Crockett stand up wasn't just to see a politician at work, it was to see a broader struggle take form in flesh and voice. And that was what made her presence across from Alan Dershowitz so magnetic. This wasn't simply a clash of two individuals. It was the cold legacy of elite legal power versus the warmth of lived experience. It was arrogance cloaked in credentials, meeting resilience born of necessity. Where Dershowitz leaned on decades of being revered, Crockett leaned on decades of being underestimated, and turning that underestimation into victory. Viewers could feel it, even if they didn't know her full biography. They could sense the weight she carried. She wasn't just defending herself. She was speaking for anyone who had been told they didn't belong in the conversation. Every tilt of her head, every pause before her reply, carried generations of quiet resistance. And that's why what she did next wasn't just a clapback. It was a moment of history. The clash began not with a shout, but with an interruption. Crockett had barely finished her first sentence when Dershowitz leaned forward, his voice slicing through hers like a gavel slamming down. "That's simply not how the Constitution works," he barked, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away a child's mistake. The host hesitated, unsure whether to rein him in, but Dershowitz plowed ahead. "I've taught this subject longer than you've been alive, Congresswoman. You can't just bend history to suit your narrative." His tone dripped with contempt, his laughter low and mocking. Crockett didn't flinch. She waited, her silence deliberate, forcing the audience to notice the imbalance, the seasoned lawyer dominating the airwaves, the congresswoman patiently letting the storm spend itself. Her calm presence made his interruptions look less like authority and more like desperation. But Dershowitz couldn't stop. He cut across her again, his voice rising. "You see, This is the problem. Politicians think they can grandstand about principles they don't understand. The smirk spread across his face as he gestured to the cameras, his performance aimed not just at her, but at the millions watching at home. And yet, the more he mocked, the more the room began to shift. The studio grew tense. Even the host shifted uneasily in his chair, glancing at Crockett as if waiting for her to break. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked on Dershowitz, her patience radiating. She wasn't rattled. She was loading. "Are you finished?" she asked softly when he finally paused for breath. The question wasn't raised in anger. It was steady, precise, like a scalpel. The audience felt the cut. Dershowitz blinked, surprised by the composure, before rushing again to fill the silence. "You're twisting the facts," he insisted, his voice louder now, his words tumbling faster, as if speed could replace substance. He talked over her again, raising his finger in the air, the classic gesture of a man desperate to retain control of the room. But each interruption revealed more than he realized. The longer he dominated, the clearer it became. This wasn't the calm authority of a scholar. It was the frantic noise of someone afraid to lose. Crockett stayed poised. Each time he interrupted, she let him dig the hole deeper. Each time he mocked, she absorbed the sting without reaction. Her strength was not in shouting back, but in choosing the exact moment when silence would shift into something sharper, something unforgettable. Viewers at home were leaning closer now, sensing that the dynamic was about to flip. They had seen this dance before, arrogance trying to drown dignity, but something in her gaze promised a different ending. The tension was no longer just between two debaters. It was between an old guard clinging to authority and a new voice preparing to claim it. And in that space, in that silence between his interruptions, the air itself seemed to tighten. The cameras caught her steady breathing, the faintest flicker of a smile. Something bigger was about to drop. For a long moment, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. The silence was deliberate, surgical, and it unsettled the room far more than any shouted retort could have. Dershowitz fidgeted, eager to jump back in, but the weight of her stillness held him in place. The audience leaned forward, the host's eyes darting nervously between them. Everyone felt it. Something was coming. Then she spoke, slowly, calmly, with a precision that cut deeper than volume ever could. "You know, Professor," she began, her tone respectful but edged with steel, "what you call experience often sounds a lot like entitlement." The air cracked. A few muffled gasps rippled through the audience. Dershowitz blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time. Crockett continued, each pause deliberate, giving her words space to settle into the silence he had once dominated. "You've spent decades telling the world what the law means. But for people like me and for the communities I come from, the law isn't an abstraction. It's not a lecture. It's life. It's eviction notices, denied benefits, paychecks stolen. It's the difference between dignity and despair." She stopped again, letting the words hang heavy. On social media, the clip would later loop endlessly, captions flashing across millions of screens. The law isn't an abstraction. It's life. Dershowitz shifted in his chair, his arms crossing defensively, the arrogance slipping into irritation. But Crockett pressed forward, her voice steady, her cadence rising with quiet intensity. "You tell me to take notes, but I've been taking notes my whole life. From the single mothers who fought systems stacked against them, from the workers whose voices never made it to your classrooms. Those are the teachers you've never met, and they taught me lessons no Ivy League hall ever could." The studio grew electric. Even the host leaned back now, sensing the ground shift beneath the debate. The audience at home erupted online, hashtags sparking in real time. #CrockettClapback, #dignity over arrogance. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let truth do the work. You say I'm out of my depth. Maybe, in your world, depth is measured by tenure and titles. But in mine, depth is measured by resilience, by the weight we carry just to be heard in rooms that weren't built for us. The metaphor landed like a hammer. Dershowitz's posture shrank visibly, his chin lower, his hands now clenched instead of gesturing. The visual was unmistakable. The giant of the legal arena reduced in real time by a woman who needed no volume, no theatrics, just authenticity. Crockett paused again, her eyes locked on his. You think this is about winning an argument? But for me and for millions watching, it's about proving that voices like ours cannot be dismissed. Not anymore. The imagined crowd roared. Not the studio audience, but the millions at home who recognized their own struggles in her words. On Twitter, memes began to fly. Dershowitz shrinking into his chair, Crockett standing tall without moving an inch. Commentators typed furiously. She didn't just clap back, she redefined the debate. Dershowitz tried to interject, but his voice faltered. For the first time, he seemed unsure, groping for footing that no longer existed. Crockett didn't need to cut him off. She had already taken the air from the room. Her closing strike came quietly, devastatingly. Respect isn't something you demand by speaking over people. It's something you earn by listening to them. Tonight, Professor, I think you forgot that. The silence that followed was deafening. The host's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The studio lights hummed, the cameras kept rolling, but the man who once dominated every debate sat wordless, his smirk erased. And for the first time, Alan Dershowitz had nothing to say. The moment Crockett delivered her final line, the silence inside the studio broke like glass shattering. For a beat, no one knew how to respond. Then it hit. The eruption didn't come from Dershowitz or the host, but from the millions watching across the country. Phones lit up, notifications pinged, timelines exploded. Within minutes, Crockett's words weren't just replaying on cable news, they were reverberating through every corner of the internet. The first hashtag was simple, blunt, and impossible to ignore. #, CrockettClapback. It began as a trickle, a few stunned viewers clipping the exchange and posting it with captions like, "She shut him down with grace." But the trickle became a flood. Soon it was trending across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The video looped endlessly, Dershowitz sneering, Crockett smiling, then delivering her precise, devastating words. Meme accounts turned his shrinking posture into visual comedy. Side by side, GIFs of a balloon deflating, a tower collapsing, a lion retreating. Celebrities chimed in almost instantly. Actors, athletes, musicians, voices that rarely agreed on politics, found common ground in Crockett's poise. "That's how you do it," one tweeted. Another posted, "Dignity greater than arrogance every time." Prominent commentators dubbed it a masterclass in restraint, the moment where silence spoke louder than shouting. Late-night comedians couldn't resist replaying the clip, their audiences howling at Dershowitz's stunned face. But beneath the humor was something heavier. The clip struck a nerve because it wasn't just Crockett versus Dershowitz. It was every woman spoken over in a meeting. Every activist dismissed by an expert, every immigrant told they were out of their depth. Viewers said they felt like they were clapping back through Crockett. She had voiced their frustration with a precision they had longed for, but rarely seen on a stage that large. One viral comment summed it up. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for all of us who have been silenced. News outlets scrambled to cover the fallout. Panel discussions dissected the power dynamic. Commentators debated whether Dershowitz had finally met his match. Editorials appeared overnight, framing the exchange as more than entertainment. It was a cultural earthquake. Because in that moment, authority had been challenged, and authenticity had won. The ripple effect didn't stop with commentary. Activists began sharing Crockett's words in organizing spaces, turning her calm takedown into rallying cries. College students quoted her in classrooms. Ministers echoed her language in sermons. For communities long ignored by power, the moment became proof that arrogance could be dismantled. Not with rage, but with dignity. Even politicians weighed in. Allies praised her composure, while detractors scrambled to dismiss the moment as theatrics. But no dismissal could compete with the tidal wave of public reaction. The story was no longer about what Dershowitz said. It was about how Jasmine Crockett answered, and how millions felt answered through her. And yet, as powerful as the immediate reaction was, the true impact went even deeper. When the uproar began to quiet, Jasmine Crockett did not seize the moment with gloating or self-congratulation. Instead, she leaned into the silence her words had created and reframed the insult she had endured. What Dershowitz had meant as a dismissal became the foundation of a universal truth. Being told you're out of your depth, she said later in a follow-up interview, is something so many Americans have heard. And not because they lack the knowledge or the strength, but because arrogance assumes it owns the room. The truth is, no one is out of their depth when they are standing in their truth. It was a simple statement, yet it carried the force of revelation. Her clapback was never just about proving Dershowitz wrong. It was about proving that dignity and truth are stronger than arrogance and mockery. She had shown that even in the face of decades of pedigree, calm resilience could disarm entitlement in seconds. This was about more than one debate. It was about who we are as a nation. The clash on live television became a mirror reflecting America's choice, to let arrogance define the narrative or to let authenticity and justice speak with clarity. Crockett's victory wasn't a win scored in sound bites. It was a reminder that the strength of a democracy lies not in titles, but in voices. Audiences felt lifted, not just entertained. They saw power where didn't needy over sneering condescension. They saw that restraint could be power, that silence could be strategy, that truth could cut sharper than the loudest insult. It was as though Crockett had taken every moment of dismissal the audience had carried in their own lives and turned it into a declaration. You are not invisible, and you are not powerless. The cinematic closing reflection was unmistakable. In a world that rewards noise, Crockett proved the power of voice, not the loudest, but the truest. She embodied justice not as an abstract legal principle, but as lived experience standing its ground. And she reminded everyone watching that resilience is not about never being underestimated. It is about rising every time someone tries to push you down. Her exchange with Dershowitz ended as a debate, but it echoed as a parable. Power without humility shrinks under scrutiny. Dignity, carried with patience and courage, grows larger than the room itself. And in that moment, Crockett's dignity filled the nation's living rooms, classrooms, and screens with a message no one could ignore. Alan Dershowitz mocked Jasmine Crockett. He dismissed her, tried to overshadow her, tried to bury her with arrogance. But in the end, it was Crockett who silenced him. Not with volume, not with anger, but with truth. Her calm, steady clapback cut through decades of condescension and left a man who never runs out of words with nothing left to say. That is the power of dignity. That is the lesson of this moment. Arrogance may sneer, it may interrupt, it may mock, but arrogance always collapses under the weight of its own emptiness. Dignity, on the other hand, endures. It speaks softly and strikes deeply. It reminds us that real power is not in how loudly you talk over others, but in how firmly you stand in your truth. This debate wasn't just a televised spat. It was a reminder of who we are and who we can be. It was about a nation deciding whether to be ruled by mockery and entitlement or guided by justice, authenticity, and resilience. Jasmine Crockett showed us what it looks like when dignity wins. And now, the choice belongs to all of us. Do we share moments like these, amplify them, let them ripple outward into the culture until arrogance can no longer hide behind its credentials? Or do we let them fade into the noise? If you believe dignity is stronger than mockery, if you believe truth deserves the last word, then make sure this moment lives beyond the screen. Subscribe, share this story. Be part of the community that refuses to be silenced. Because when we stand together in our truth, no arrogance, no matter how loud, can drown us out.